from
Yeah.
Oceania, which that's not an area people talk about very often. And you've made great effort. You mentioned it in your article on CT. You mentioned in the conversation. It seems like this is a new area of discovery for you personally, and you've written and want to share that with other people. I want to hear more about this. What has brought this out that and you think we should hear from, and what God is doing there?
Yeah, I really love that you asked this question. Thank you. Because what we're doing is Christianity in every country of the world, truly global, the most global attempt, every country, meaning every island nation that you've never heard of. That's what we're all about. It's global or bust. And there's all these island nations in the Pacific Islands that most people have never heard of. French Polynesia, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, just a lot of places that seem insignificant, frankly, either because you can't see them on a map, most maps, it's hard to see these tiny places, or because their populations are really small. So they're just kind of far removed from the discourse. But what's interesting to me about the Pacific Islands in particular, there's two things. One, the Pacific Islands became Christian by a partnership model between Western missions and indigenous Christians. So Christianity was introduced to the islands in a particular place and time. People became Christians, and then from one island to the next, Christianity moved. Over a really short amount of time, over the 19th and early 20th century, the Pacific Islands became majority Christian. And from a percentage perspective, the Pacific Islands are more Christian than Sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about Sub-Saharan Africa all the time, but we never talk about the Pacific Islands. So that's one reason it's interesting, because there's this fabulous partnership model of mission that existed there that was completely overlooked by the Western missionary movement in its analysis of it. The other thing that's interesting about the Pacific Islands that I think we need to be looking towards them more is the climate crisis. These island nations are pretty much at sea level or really close to sea level, and they feel the impacts of climate change disproportionate to their own actions. So it's the actions of the USA, China, India, huge countries, USA being the country with the most Christians, right? We should have a moral responsibility to care for Christians elsewhere in the world. Things that we do in the United States impacts these people in the Pacific Islands. So that when the tide comes in, it covers their cemeteries. It comes into their churches and renders them unusable until the tide goes back out. They are literally trying to decide if they should just all go to New Zealand in some of these places, because they see that their entire country and societies and cultures and histories are at risk of extinction. So we're looking at the extinction of Christian peoples in the Pacific Islands, and we're still having a debate in the United States if climate change is real. So if we want to be globalists and we want to be global Christians, we have to look at how what we do impacts other people around the world. And the Pacific Islands is one of the best examples of that.
I've heard stories of people having to move their island, leave their home because it was, I just didn't realize and put it in that type of context. That's very sobering, very sobering. Yes. Talking about Oceania for a minute, is it Oceania or Oceania?
Either way.
Well, I'm sure they have a preference. I want to make sure I get it right, but that's okay.
I say Oceania is what I say.
Oceania. Okay. Potato. Yeah. It's one of those. But looking at the countries, you mentioned these different countries. One of the things that I was really blown away by, and I have a huge question for you on this. I want to make sure I get my data right. You mentioned there are 233 countries plus Kosovo. But yet, when I look at, according to the member states of the United Nations, there's like 195, 96, 97 in there, that number. How did we miss 37-ish countries? What classifies as a country?
So we're using the United Nations Demographic Database, which has a slightly different list than that list you were looking at of UN member states. So the demographic database is using a different definition of what a country is. And in fact, since my book came out last September, the UN population revision came out, and now there's 237 countries in the world. So there's actually a few more than what's in that book, which is just the unfortunate consequence of doing the demography of religion, is that it's constantly changing. They have their own idea of what a country is and what a country isn't. But so, for example, between the 234 and 237, there was the Caribbean Netherlands was a group of 3 islands, and they broke out into individual islands, countries, according to the UN. So sometimes it's just small changes like that. If Scotland ever decides to break away from the UK, they'll be their own independent country. And so there's all these kind of geopolitical realities going on all around the world all the time. And we just watch to see what the tipping point is when they get recognized by the UN.